Imagine waking up one morning with the unsettling realization that every pleasure you've ever pursued, every dopamine hit, every moment of satisfaction, every indulgence that promised fulfillment has been nothing more than an elaborate prison cell, beautifully decorated to keep you from noticing the bars. Picture yourself standing in your own life, looking around at all the things that once brought you joy. The endless scroll through social media, the shopping sprees that temporarily lifted your mood, the binge-watching sessions that numbed your restlessness, the validation you craved from others' approval. Now imagine discovering that each of these seemingly innocent pleasures was actually a sophisticated form of psychological imprisonment designed not by some external force, but by the very parts of yourself you've been running from your entire life. This is not a comfortable thought. It's the kind of realization that makes your skin crawl and your mind revolt, because it suggests that the very foundation of how you've been living, the pursuit of happiness, the avoidance of pain, the endless search for the next moment of satisfaction, might be the very thing that's been keeping you trapped in a life that feels increasingly hollow, despite being filled with more opportunities for pleasure than any generation in human history has ever known. Carl Jung, the revolutionary Swiss psychiatrist who dared to map the darkest territories of the human psyche, understood something about pleasure that most of us spend our entire lives avoiding. He saw that our relationship with pleasure isn't just misguided, it's backwards, upside down, and fundamentally self-destructive in ways that go far deeper than addiction or simple overindulgence. Jung recognized that every pleasure we seek unconsciously may be connected to a pain we have buried, and every indulgence might be an echo of something we are desperately unwilling to confront within ourselves. Consider this paradox that would have fascinated Jung. We live in an age of unprecedented access to pleasure, instant food delivery, infinite entertainment, on-demand gratification at every turn, yet rates of depression, anxiety, and existential emptiness have never been higher. How is this possible? How can a society drowning in pleasurable options be simultaneously starving for meaning, connection, and authentic joy? Jung would tell you this isn't a coincidence. It's the inevitable result of what he called psychic inflation, where the ego becomes bloated with false identity and hollow satisfaction. But here's where Jung's insights become truly disturbing. What if the pleasure you're chasing isn't even yours? What if it belongs to what Jung called your shadow? The wounded, unconscious parts of yourself that you've repressed, denied, and avoided. What if every time you reach for that familiar comfort, that reliable distraction, that soothing indulgence, you're not actually nurturing your true self, but feeding a fragmented echo of your psyche that's desperately trying to get your attention through increasingly sophisticated forms of self-medication? Jung observed that when we consume pleasure unconsciously, it begins to consume us. When we indulge without reflection, we risk falling into what he described as a state where our unconscious drives and unhealed wounds masquerade as desires. That scroll through social media that promises connection but delivers isolation? That might be your inner child crying out to be seen. That compulsive shopping that promises transformation but leaves you empty? That could be your shadow attempting to fill a void that no external purchase can ever touch. This is the great question that haunts Jung's work and demands an answer from anyone brave enough to look honestly at their own life. Are you using pleasure to grow and expand into your authentic self? Or are you using it to hide and contract away from the very experiences that could liberate you? Are your moments of satisfaction bringing you closer to what Jung called individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming whole? Or are they sophisticated forms of self-abandonment dressed up as self-care? The implications of this question are staggering, because they suggest that beneath every mindless indulgence lies what Jung recognized as a profound spiritual hunger, a longing for wholeness, for integration, for connection with your true self that no amount of external stimulation can ever satisfy. Jung wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Your pleasures, he understood, are often the unconscious's favorite tools, masking themselves as desires, but rooted in the very fears you're trying to avoid. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you see every impulse, every craving, every moment when you reach for something outside yourself for comfort or satisfaction. Because Jung's final revelation, the one that transforms everything, shows us that real pleasure isn't something we pursue at all. It's something that emerges when we stop running from our wounds and begin to understand them. When we stop medicating our shadow and start integrating it. When we stop seeking escape and start seeking truth. Stay with me through this entire journey, because what Jung understood about the relationship between pleasure, pain, and the path to psychological wholeness will shatter every assumption you've ever made about how to live a fulfilling life. By the end, you'll never look at a single moment of pleasure or pain the same way again. The problem begins in a place most of us never think to look: in the very architecture of how we've learned to relate to our own inner experience. Jung discovered that modern civilization has created what he called a collective neurosis, a shared psychological wound that manifests as our compulsive need to stay on the surface of life, skimming along the comfortable shallows while the depths of our psyche remain unexplored and unintegrated. But this wasn't always the case. Jung observed that throughout most of human history, pleasure served a fundamentally different function. In ancient cultures, pleasure was ritualistic, communal, and deeply connected to meaning-making. It was embedded within frameworks of spiritual significance, seasonal cycles, and collective purpose. The pleasure of harvest festivals wasn't just about enjoyment. It was about gratitude, community, and connection to the rhythms of life itself. Even individual pleasures were understood within larger contexts of personal development and spiritual growth. What happened? Jung would point to what he called the disenchantment of the world, a phrase he borrowed from sociologist Max Weber to describe how modern rational materialism stripped away the symbolic, sacred dimensions of human experience. When we lost our connection to the archetypal realm, that deep layer of shared human symbols and patterns that Jung called the collective unconscious, we also lost our ability to engage with pleasure as anything more than mere sensation. Friedrich Nietzsche, whose work profoundly influenced Jung, saw this coming. His famous declaration that God is dead wasn't a celebration, but a warning. Nietzsche understood that when a culture loses its transcendent framework for meaning, it doesn't become more rational, it becomes more neurotic. People begin seeking in the material world what can only be found in the realm of spirit and psyche. They begin using pleasure not as a doorway to deeper experience, but as a substitute for it. This is where Jung's understanding becomes psychologically revolutionary. He recognized that every individual psyche contains what he called archetypal patterns, universal themes, and energies that seek expression through our lives. The lover archetype, for instance, doesn't just want sexual pleasure. It wants union, transcendence, the dissolution of ego boundaries in service of something greater. The innocent archetype doesn't just want comfort. It wants safety, wonder, the experience of being unconditionally cherished. The magician archetype doesn't just want control. It wants the power to transform reality through will and understanding. But here's the crucial insight. When we're unconscious of these deeper archetypal needs, we try to satisfy them through their most superficial expressions. The lover becomes mere sexual compulsion or romantic fantasy. The innocent becomes regression into childlike dependency or the pursuit of artificial comfort. The magician becomes manipulation, addiction to stimulation, or the illusion of control through consumption. Jung called this process participation mystique, a psychological state where we unconsciously project our inner archetypal energies onto external objects, people, or experiences, believing they can provide what only inner integration can deliver. This is why that new purchase, that perfect vacation, that ideal relationship, that next achievement always promises to be the one that will finally make you happy, yet somehow never quite delivers the lasting satisfaction it seemed to offer. Arthur Schopenhauer, whose pessimistic philosophy deeply influenced both Nietzsche and Jung, understood this dynamic through his concept of will. For Schopenhauer, human beings are driven by a blind, insatiable will that can never be permanently satisfied. Every pleasure we achieve simply reveals new desires, creating what he called the pendulum swing between want and boredom. But Jung took this insight further, recognizing that this endless cycle of craving isn't inevitable. It's a symptom of psychological unconsciousness. The hidden problem runs even deeper than individual psychology. Jung observed that entire cultures can fall into collective shadow projections, where the unconscious aspects of the collective psyche get projected onto others, different races, nations, ideologies, or social groups. In our current context, we've collectively projected our spiritual and psychological needs onto the marketplace, onto technology, onto the endless array of products and experiences that promise to deliver what Jung knew could only come from within. This is why every generation seems to need more stimulation than the last. What excited your grandparents seems quaint to you. What thrills you now will seem mild to your children. We're caught in what Jung would recognize as an inflation cycle, constantly needing more because we're trying to fill an inner void with external content, not realizing that the void itself is sacred space, the very emptiness that allows for genuine fulfillment to emerge. Viktor Frankl, a student of both Freudian and Jungian psychology who survived the Nazi concentration camps, saw this pattern play out in its most extreme form. He noticed that the prisoners who survived weren't necessarily the physically strongest, but those who maintained what he called meaning-making capacity, the ability to find significance in their suffering. Frankl realized that human beings can endure almost anything if it has meaning, but we cannot tolerate meaninglessness, even when surrounded by pleasure. This connects directly to Jung's understanding of what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's natural ability to bridge conscious and unconscious content, creating new possibilities for growth and integration. When this function is active, even difficult experiences can feel meaningful and transformative. When it's dormant, even pleasurable experiences feel empty and compulsive. Jung also understood that our relationship with pleasure reveals our relationship with time itself. Unconscious pleasure is always about escaping the present moment, either by trying to recreate past satisfactions or by fantasizing about future fulfillment. But conscious pleasure, what Jung would call integrated pleasure, happens only in presence, when we're fully available to what's actually occurring within and around us. This is why meditation traditions across cultures have always understood that the path to genuine happiness requires, paradoxically, the willingness to sit with unhappiness without immediately trying to change it. It's not masochism, it's recognition that our pain often contains the very information we need to grow beyond the patterns that created it. The hidden problem, then, isn't pleasure itself, but our unconscious relationship to it. We've learned to use pleasure as a drug rather than as a doorway, as an escape rather than as an engagement, as a way of avoiding our depth rather than as a path toward it. And this unconscious pattern doesn't just affect our individual lives, it shapes our entire civilization, creating what Jung saw as a collective addiction to the surface of experience, while the depths remain untouched and unexplored. But recognizing the problem is only the beginning. The real question becomes, how deep does this unconscious pattern go, and what are its true consequences for how we live, love, and understand ourselves? The psychological prison Jung identified doesn't announce itself with fanfare or obvious symptoms. Instead, it operates through a kind of spiritual anesthesia, a gradual numbing of your capacity to feel deeply, to respond authentically, and to recognize the difference between what feeds your soul and what merely pacifies your nervous system. The consequences of our unconscious relationship with pleasure aren't dramatic. They're insidious, weaving themselves into the fabric of daily life until what feels normal is actually a profound disconnection from your own aliveness. Consider what Jung called the provisional life, the psychological state where you're always living in preparation for some future moment when real life will finally begin, when you'll finally be happy, successful, loved, or free. This isn't just procrastination. It's a sophisticated defense mechanism that uses the promise of future pleasure to avoid the intensity of present moment experience. You spend your 20s preparing for your 30s preparing for retirement, your entire life preparing for some mythical moment when you'll finally have permission to be fully alive. Meanwhile, your unconscious mind is collecting evidence that present moment experience is inherently lacking, that satisfaction always exists somewhere else, in some other circumstance, some other version of yourself. This creates what cognitive psychologists now recognize as hedonic adaptation, the tendency for any pleasure to lose its intensity over time, requiring ever-increasing doses to achieve the same effect. But Jung understood this wasn't just a quirk of brain chemistry. It was the inevitable result of seeking transcendence through immanence, trying to find the eternal through the temporal. The neurological consequences are profound. When you habitually use pleasure to avoid discomfort, you're literally rewiring your brain's reward pathways. Dr. Anna Lemke's research on dopamine and addiction reveals that our brains naturally balance pleasure and pain. But when we consistently tip the scales toward pleasure-seeking, we create what she calls dopamine dysregulation. Your baseline level of satisfaction drops, making ordinary experiences feel flat, and requiring increasingly intense stimulation to feel normal. But Jung saw something even more subtle happening at the psychological level. He noticed that when people live primarily in reaction to pleasure and pain, constantly moving toward one and away from the other, they gradually lose touch with what he called the transcendent function, their natural capacity for creative response rather than compulsive reaction. They become, in essence, sophisticated biological machines, responding predictably to stimuli rather than authoring their own experience from a place of conscious choice. This shows up in relationships as what Jung identified as projection. Instead of relating to people as they actually are, you unconsciously cast them in roles designed to provide specific forms of pleasure or avoid particular forms of pain. Your partner becomes your source of validation, your friends become your entertainment system, your family becomes your security blanket. But people can't actually fulfill these functions without losing their own authenticity, creating relationships that feel simultaneously intimate and deeply lonely. The cultural consequences extend far beyond individual psychology. Jung observed that societies caught in unconscious pleasure-seeking inevitably develop what he called mass-mindedness, the tendency for individuals to lose their capacity for independent thought and feeling, instead deriving their sense of identity from collective trends, opinions, and behaviors. This isn't conscious conformity, it's unconscious merger, where the boundaries between self and culture become so blurred that you can't distinguish between your authentic desires and manufactured ones. Look around at contemporary culture, and you'll see Jung's predictions playing out with startling accuracy. We have infinite access to information, but decreasing capacity for wisdom. We have unprecedented connectivity, but epidemic levels of loneliness. We have more entertainment options than any civilization in history, but can't sit in silence for 10 minutes without anxiety. We have more therapeutic techniques and self-help resources than ever before, yet rates of depression and anxiety continue climbing. This is what Jung meant when he wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Our entire civilization has organized itself around avoiding this acceptance, creating elaborate systems of distraction that promise fulfillment while delivering its opposite. We've become experts at managing symptoms while remaining unconscious of causes, treating the effects while strengthening the patterns that create them. The economic system itself has evolved to profit from this unconsciousness. Marketing psychology has become increasingly sophisticated at triggering what Jung called autonomous complexes, psychological patterns that operate independently of conscious choice. Advertisers don't just sell products, they sell temporary solutions to existential problems, promising that the right purchase will solve identity confusion, relationship difficulties, or spiritual emptiness. But perhaps the most devastating consequence is what Jung termed the loss of soul. In his understanding, the soul isn't a religious concept, but a psychological reality, the part of you that gives meaning to experience, that connects individual life to larger patterns of significance, that transforms mere events into meaningful story. When you habitually escape into unconscious pleasure, you train yourself to skim along the surface of experience rather than diving into its depths. This creates what existential philosophers call existential vacuum, a sense of fundamental emptiness that no amount of pleasure can fill because the emptiness itself is sacred space, the very opening through which meaning and purpose naturally arise. But instead of learning to inhabit this emptiness consciously, we panic and try to fill it with whatever's available, not realizing that this very filling is what maintains the sense of emptiness. The neuroplasticity research confirms Jung's intuitions. Your brain literally reshapes itself based on how you habitually direct your attention. If you consistently use external stimulation to avoid internal discomfort, you strengthen neural pathways associated with seeking and weaken those associated with contentment, presence, and intrinsic motivation. Over time, you become physiologically dependent on external input for emotional regulation. But Jung identified an even subtler consequence, the gradual erosion of what he called symbolic thinking. When you relate to experiences only at their surface-level pleasure as mere sensation, achievement as mere status, relationships as mere entertainment, you lose access to their deeper symbolic significance. You become, in Jung's words, symbolically impoverished, unable to recognize the archetypal patterns playing out through your life experiences. This symbolic impoverishment creates what Jung saw as the root of modern neurosis, a sense of meaninglessness that can't be cured by more pleasure, because the problem isn't lack of stimulation, but lack of depth. You can have everything you thought you wanted and still feel fundamentally empty because you've lost touch with the part of yourself that knows how to transform experience into meaning. The social consequences ripple outward in ways Jung predicted with disturbing accuracy. When individuals lose their connection to symbolic depth, they become vulnerable to what he called mass movements, political, social, or cultural phenomena that promise to provide meaning and identity from the outside. They become susceptible to ideology, consumerism, nationalism, or any other system that offers to solve through external means what can only be resolved through inner integration. This is why Jung saw the rise of totalitarian movements in the 20th century, not as political accidents, but as psychological inevitabilities. When people lose their individual connection to meaning, they become desperate for collective meaning, even if it requires surrendering their capacity for independent thought and feeling. The question that emerges from recognizing these consequences is both urgent and hopeful. If our unconscious relationship with pleasure has created this elaborate prison, what becomes possible when we begin to relate to it consciously? What opens up when we stop using pleasure to escape ourselves and start using it to come home to ourselves? The rebellion begins not with rejecting pleasure, but with a radical shift in how you approach the very concept of satisfaction itself. Jung discovered that true liberation requires what he called holding the tension of opposites, learning to stay present with both pleasure and pain, desire and fulfillment, longing and contentment, without immediately collapsing into one side or the other. This isn't passive acceptance. It's an active engagement with the full spectrum of human experience that most of us spend our lives trying to avoid. But before you can hold this tension, you must first recognize how deeply you've been conditioned to collapse it. Every time you reach for your phone when you feel lonely, every time you buy something when you feel empty, every time you binge watch when you feel restless, you're unconsciously training yourself to believe that discomfort is a problem to be solved rather than information to be integrated. Jung understood that this pattern, repeated thousands of times, creates what he called psychic automatism responses, so habitual they happen without conscious choice. The first step in breaking free is what Jung called active imagination, a practice of consciously engaging with the images, impulses, and desires that usually drive you unconsciously. Instead of immediately acting on the urge to scroll, shop, or consume, you pause and dialogue with it. You ask, what are you really wanting? What are you trying to tell me? What would happen if I listened to you without immediately giving you what you think you need? This sounds simple, but it's actually revolutionary because it introduces consciousness into patterns that have been operating automatically. When you pause between impulse and action, you create what Viktor Frankl called the space between stimulus and response, the very space where freedom lives. But this space initially feels uncomfortable, even anxiety-provoking, because you're breaking a pattern your nervous system has learned to rely on for emotional regulation. Jung worked with patients for decades who had tried every form of conventional therapy without lasting change. What he discovered was that healing doesn't happen through analyzing why patterns exist, but through consciously experiencing them differently. He called this living the questions rather than rushing toward answers. When you feel the familiar craving for distraction, instead of immediately satisfying it or trying to make it go away, you learn to become curious about it. What does this craving feel like in my body? What images or memories arise when I sit with it? What would this part of me say if it could speak? This isn't therapy in the conventional sense. It's what Jung called individuation, the process of developing a conscious relationship with the unconscious aspects of your psyche, rather than being unconsciously driven by them. But Jung understood that intellectual insight alone wasn't enough. Real transformation requires what he called the sacrifice of the ego, the willingness to let go of the familiar identity that has been built around avoiding discomfort. This doesn't mean destroying your personality. It means recognizing that who you think you are has been largely constructed around patterns of seeking and avoiding that keep you unconscious. Consider the radical approach of Aldous Huxley, who experimented with consciousness-altering substances, not for escapism, but for what he called the doors of perception, direct experiences of reality beyond the narrow bandwidth of ordinary consciousness. Huxley understood what Jung intuited, that most of what we call normal consciousness is actually a severely restricted awareness, filtered through conditioning that keeps us focused on seeking pleasure and avoiding pain rather than engaging with the deeper dimensions of experience. The rebellion requires developing what Jung called the witness consciousness, the part of you that can observe your patterns without being unconsciously identified with them. When you notice yourself reaching for familiar comforts, instead of judging yourself or forcing yourself to stop, you practice stepping back and watching the pattern unfold with curiosity rather than reactivity. This witnessing isn't detachment, it's intimate presence. You're not trying to rise above your humanity, but to inhabit it more fully. Jung observed that people who successfully integrated their unconscious patterns didn't transcend them. They developed conscious relationships with them. They learned to work with their psychology rather than being worked by it. The historical examples Jung studied reveal a consistent pattern. Individuals who achieved genuine transformation invariably went through what he called the dark night of the soul, periods where their familiar ways of finding satisfaction stopped working, forcing them to discover deeper sources of fulfillment. Mystics across cultures describe similar processes. Saint Planus, John of the Cross with his dark night, the Buddha's encounter with suffering, Nietzsche's confrontation with nihilism. But Jung democratized this process, showing that you don't need to be a saint or philosopher to access these transformative experiences. Every time you choose to stay present with discomfort instead of immediately seeking relief, you're engaging in what he called active suffering, consciously experiencing what you would normally avoid, not as masochism but as a doorway to integration. This creates what Jung termed the transcendent function, your psyche's natural capacity to synthesize conscious and unconscious content into new possibilities. When you stop using pleasure to escape the present moment, you begin accessing what's actually available in the present moment: creativity, intuition, authentic connection, the capacity for response rather than reaction. The rebellion also requires recognizing how your pleasure-seeking patterns are often attempts to recreate childhood experiences of safety, connection, or validation that were interrupted or insufficient. Jung called these infantile fantasies, unconscious beliefs that someone or something external can provide what you needed as a child. The mature approach isn't to shame these parts of yourself, but to develop what he called the internal good parent, the capacity to provide for your own emotional needs rather than seeking them through external consumption. This doesn't mean becoming self-sufficient in the conventional sense. It means developing a conscious relationship with your neediness rather than being unconsciously driven by it. When you can acknowledge, "I'm feeling lonely," without immediately trying to fix it through social media, or "I'm feeling empty," without reaching for food, shopping, or entertainment, you create space for deeper forms of nourishment to emerge. Jung noticed that people who successfully made this transition often reported a paradoxical experience. As they became less dependent on external pleasure, they became more capable of genuine enjoyment. Food tasted better when they weren't eating to avoid feelings. Relationships became more satisfying when they weren't unconsciously demanding that others provide validation. Achievement felt more meaningful when it wasn't driven by the need to prove worth. This is because consciousness itself is inherently pleasurable. When you're fully present with experience, rather than using experience to avoid other experience, you tap into what Jung called the joy of consciousness, the natural satisfaction that comes from being awake rather than asleep to your own life. The rebellion culminates in what Jung considered the goal of human development: the capacity to choose your responses based on what actually serves your growth rather than what temporarily relieves your discomfort. This isn't willpower in the conventional sense. It's wisdom, the ability to distinguish between what feeds your soul and what merely pacifies your psychology. But to understand how profound this transformation can be, we must explore Jung's deepest insight about the relationship between suffering and joy, between the darkness we avoid and the light we seek. Because what he discovered about the nature of wholeness will challenge everything you think you know about what it means to be human. Here is the truth that will fundamentally alter how you understand the very nature of human existence. Jung discovered that what you call pleasure and what you call pain are not opposites at all, but two faces of the same profound mystery, the soul's relentless drive toward wholeness. Everything you've been taught about happiness being good and suffering being bad, about pleasure being the goal and pain being the obstacle, represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how consciousness actually works. Jung spent decades studying what he called the union of opposites, And what he found will shatter every assumption you've made about how to live. He discovered that the psyche doesn't seek pleasure, it seeks completion. It doesn't avoid pain, it uses pain as a navigation system toward the parts of yourself that have been abandoned, denied, or exiled. Every moment of suffering in your life has been an invitation to reclaim something essential that you've lost touch with. Every moment of authentic pleasure has been a glimpse of what becomes possible when you're no longer at war with yourself. This is why Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. He understood that your true self isn't the person you become by accumulating more pleasures and avoiding more pains. Your true self is what emerges when you stop using pleasure and pain as reasons to abandon yourself and start using them as doorways back home to your own wholeness. Consider what Jung called the wounded healer, the archetype that appears in every culture's wisdom traditions. The wounded healer isn't someone who has transcended suffering, but someone who has learned to transform their wounds into sources of wisdom and compassion. They don't seek pleasure to escape their pain. They discover that their deepest wounds, when consciously engaged, become their greatest gifts to the world. This isn't romanticizing suffering. It's recognizing that consciousness itself has the power to transform any experience into meaning. This realization leads to perhaps the most liberating insight in all of Jung's work. You don't need to fix yourself because you were never broken. You don't need to improve yourself because you were never inadequate. What you call your problems are actually your psyche's sophisticated attempts to guide you toward experiences and qualities that your conscious mind has been avoiding. Your anxiety might be pointing toward unexpressed creativity. Your depression might be calling you toward a depth that superficial pleasures can never reach. Your restlessness might be your soul's way of saying that your current life is too small for who you're becoming. But here's where Jung's insight becomes truly revolutionary. When you stop trying to escape your inner experience and start learning to inhabit it fully, something extraordinary happens. The boundaries between pleasure and pain begin to dissolve, not because you become numb, but because you discover what Jung called the transcendent function, your natural capacity to find meaning and even joy in any experience when you approach it with conscious presence rather than unconscious resistance. This is why the great spiritual traditions speak of bliss rather than pleasure. Bliss isn't the absence of difficulty, it's the presence of meaning. It's what happens when you're so fully engaged with life that the question of whether something feels good or bad becomes secondary to the deeper question of whether it's real, whether it's true, whether it's calling forth more of who you actually are. Jung discovered that this transformation doesn't happen through thinking about it, but through what he called active imagination, consciously engaging with the images, feelings, and impulses that arise from your unconscious. When you learn to dialogue with your shadow rather than projecting it onto others, when you learn to honor your wounds rather than medicating them, when you learn to trust your soul's agenda rather than your ego's preferences, you begin to experience what he called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole. The ultimate truth Jung discovered is this: you are not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. You are not broken and in need of fixing, but whole and in need of remembering. The pleasure you've been seeking outside yourself has always been waiting inside yourself. The pain you've been running from has always been trying to guide you home. And when you finally understand this, not intellectually, but experientially, not as a concept, but as a lived reality, you discover what Jung called the secret of the golden flower. The recognition that everything you've ever wanted was always right here, waiting for you to stop seeking and start seeing, to stop running and start returning, to stop becoming and start being who you have already been. This is why you'll never look at pleasure the same way again. Because now you know that real pleasure isn't something you pursue. It's something you are when you stop pursuing anything at all and finally, courageously, beautifully, come home to the magnificent mystery of your own existence.